Hello A-level students and welcome to this third lesson looking at how to analyse spoken discourse texts. This lesson will look at the actual features of language, of spoken language itself. Just as a reminder, we are studying the AQA English Language and Literature syllabus, and we are gearing towards looking or analysing the spoken texts in remembered places. If you're a student of A-level English language, this lesson might also be interesting for you. Last couple of lessons we looked at spoken mode in contrast to written mode, which gave us a kind of an overall awareness, I guess, of the differences between speech and writing. And then in lesson 2 we looked at the main contextual theories. The main theories that answer the question, why is speech taking place in this way? The pragmatic theories. And that was AO3. That was our understanding of the influence of contexts of production and reception. Today we'll be looking at AO1, which is the applied linguistic analysis, which is your ability to use terminology effectively and to apply the language levels. And we're going to try and organise what we look at around the language levels. In this lesson, you're going to look at the distinctive features of spoken language, and especially how the following get used: Lexis and semantics of spoken discourse, how the grammar of constructions in spoken discourse varies and is different from written grammar, non-fluency features that help speakers maintain continuous spontaneous speech. We're going to look at how spoken discourse is structured and topic management or topic control, and we will look at turn taking in conversation and how that functions and how that could be analysed. Your understanding of mode and pragmatics will help you obviously to interpret these language features. To a certain extent we'll be looking out of context today because we'll be looking at the language itself, but in the end we'll be finding ways to connect all of these things together into a coherent analysis for your remembered places question. Okay, so let's get going. You'll know that one of the main language levels is Lexis and semantics, which means the words chosen and the meanings that they connote. Spontaneous spoken discourse is commonly full of colloquialisms, idioms and slang. Of course, it depends on varying contexts, on the formality of your context, but most spontaneous spoken discourse is full of these features. Also, cliches and what we would call dead metaphors, which are metaphors that have become so common they've come to have a kind of a meaning in their own that doesn't need to be worked out. These are also common features of spoken language. And all of these constructions, colloquialisms, idioms, slang, cliche, they're all, if you like, ready-made meaning packages. We don't have time to be deeply creative or original in spontaneous speech, and so we use these cliches, we use idioms and slang phrases because they actually require little effort for either the listener and also little effort for the listener, but also the speaker to produce and to receive. They're little convenient packages of meaning. We also use contractions and elisions, so we shorten words and we run words into each other, which is a sign of reduced formality, but it's also convenient in speech for a fluent kind of delivery. And I suppose you could argue that contractions in written language, such as don't, won't, I'll, actually have their origins in spoken language, where we don't always take the time to enunciate every syllable. And actually it seems strange saying do not in spoken language. I suppose we use do not rather than don't when we are foregrounding our seriousness of our order, if you like, but it's much more natural in spoken language to use a contraction like don't. Another example, because we very rarely actually pronounce the full, all of the syllables of that word. Because is common in spoken language. In spoken language we use phatic expressions, which are politeness features, and they don't really convey any meaning, such as when we see someone we say all right and they say all right. These are, I guess, they're not devoid of meaning because they have a social function. You're acknowledging someone, but the language itself doesn't really have any meaning. It seems to function like, say, for example, a nod would function. It's just a gesture of acknowledgement rather than having meaning itself. And what we call phatic expression is what we call small talk. Obviously, we don't in writing tend to bother with phatic expressions, although we do have greetings, salutations and farewells on letters, which I guess have a similar function to phatic expression in speech. Finally, for semantics, what we say, the Lexis we choose often has connotations perhaps beyond the literal meaning, and that's where I guess spoken language has its own semantics, particularly sarcasm, irony, euphemism and dysphemism, examples where we're saying more or less than what we're actually saying. We make allusion, and of course we can use figurative expressions like simile and metaphor and personification in speech, and they operate much in the same way that they would operate in written language. Of course, the context is always slightly different in spoken language. For example, it's much easier to convey sarcasm in spoken language because you have extra-linguistic or what we would call paralinguistic cues, such as your facial expression. We often use our facial expression to convey when we're sarcastic. And that, I guess, alerts our listener that we're connoting more than we are directly saying. That's very difficult to do in written language, and so when we do want to use sarcasm and irony, we sometimes have to do it in slightly more obvious ways. Mixed mode texts, we did look before at what you might call group chat and how this combines features of spoken language and written language. Emojis, which, as you know, are sort of little examples of they're little extra-linguistic units of meaning. They're not language themselves, but they convey what a facial expression would convey in spoken language. So we might use a winky emoji to signify that we're being sarcastic, and that would take the place of a facial gesture in spoken language and allow our language in a sort of a chat room or a message forum or a group chat format. It would allow us to convey sarcasm in much the same way that we would in a spoken context. So connotations of language, we know that semantics is about where more is conveyed than is directly said, and those features are live in spoken language as well. Grammar of spoken language is very drastically different, and one of the things that we observed in lesson 1 was that transcripted conversations and transcripted speech doesn't feature full stops and doesn't feature capital letters. We need not to refer to spoken language in terms of sentences, because sentences are a feature of written language and not spoken language. We do not speak in sentences. Yes, we do speak in grammatical units, and we can call those constructions, grammatical constructions, but they aren't necessarily sentences, and we shouldn't try and apply the rules of sentence grammar that we would apply in writing to spoken constructions, because we just don't need that level of precision in order to convey meaning. Punctuation, for example, is redundant in spoken language. So let's think about how grammatical constructions in spoken language are perhaps different or the things that make them unique. Well, actually, we can convey a lot through very, very broken or fragmented grammar in speech. And our constructions, spoken constructions, can be interrupted, abandoned and restarted, and false starts and repairs are very common in spontaneous communication, spontaneous spoken language. A false start is where a sentence or a phrase has been begun one way and then the speaker then stops and begins it another way. A repair is an example of perhaps where a grammatical construction, a speaker then goes back and corrects a mistake that they have made. These are very, very common, they're ubiquitous features really of grammar in spontaneous spoken discourse. Grammar itself is often disjointed or fragmented. There's often disagreements. that would obviously be identified as errors in written language, but really we can get away with disagreements in spoken language as they still convey meaning. Incomplete sentences, we often use ellipsis, i.e. Incomplete utterances or incomplete constructions in spoken language, and often we don't need to complete our construction in a grammatical sense in order to have conveyed meaning. And sometimes, of course, leaving a sentence incomplete can itself convey some kind of meaning. It could be highly suggestive. Generally speaking, the grammar of spoken discourse is non-standard. And there's a great example. You don't know nothing, an example of a double negative, which obviously would be wrong in written language, but is very common in spoken language. Long chains of conjunctions, young writers tend to do this, is stringing together multiple sentences with and of course we remember from lesson 1 that spoken language is primary. We learn to speak and listen before we learn to read and write, and actually when children learn to read and write, we find that their writing is full of these kinds of features, these kinds of disjointed or fragmented features. And why is that? It's because those children haven't yet learned the specific rules of writing, and they're applying a kind of a spoken approach to their writing. It's why they don't use full stops. It takes a lot of work to get some students to use full stops, and they instead might use endless chains of conjunctions. In writing, that tends to lessen the clarity of a piece of writing because it doesn't give a reader time to actually stop and process what's been said. But we process much more quickly what we listen than what we read. And also a speaker may use pauses that will help us to process what we have. So these long chains of conjunctions are quite common, and they're not necessarily a barrier to meaning. So we know that all of these features that we're looking at, all of this fragmented grammar of spoken constructions, will have its own contextual influence in different situations. So the level of confidence of speech, hopefully I'm speaking without too many false starts and repairs. I haven't rehearsed word for word, but my speech is fairly well directed. It's not fully spontaneous, and I obviously have this PowerPoint to help me structure it. Whereas if you were asked to speak on something entirely spontaneously, with a low level of confidence, we might expect much more in the way of false starts and repairs. Status, formality, emotional response, do we become more fragmented when we become more emotional? Well, possibly so. And whatever our relationship with the given topic is, these are all contextual factors that might influence the way that the grammar of our spoken discourse. So with that, that's quite a lot of information. I would like you to pause the video at this point and have a look at this little interchange between Mike and Sophia. And I'd like to ask you how features of Lexis and semantics and the grammar of these constructions might be labelled on this short extract. So hopefully you found that fairly easy to identify some of the features in there. There were false starting and repairs in Mike's utterance at the beginning. I have also labelled some dexis on this, which we looked at last lesson. And later when we look at these extracts in detail, we'll look at actually analysing or interpreting these features, but right now a little bit of feature spotting will help us perhaps to understand. There's a euphemism in there related to waiters in Paris. We use euphemism as a politeness feature, particularly in British English. We looked last lesson in pragmatics at politeness. Speakers often avoid being too direct or too dysphomistic, particularly in British, where politeness is a very strong feature of the British way of speaking. There are contractions in there, of course, like they'll, and there are incomplete constructions. Okay. Moving on then, how do we sustain spoken language? And I make no apology for my comedy picture, because hopefully it will get you to remember these two key features. We have bad filler and nice hedge. Okay, but what do filler and hedge mean in a linguistic context? Fillers and hedges are features that help us to keep thinking spontaneously, to keep speaking whilst we're thinking spontaneously. We don't stop to think. We continue, and if you like, our speech has these sort of autopilot features that help us to fill in the gaps. What we do is we use fillers to give us thinking time, you know what I mean. And we talked before in Lexis about the use of cliche and slang, and these often, cliches and slang, often have the function of fillers. I described those as quite low demand features, little pre-packaged units of meaning. Well, a filler itself perhaps has no meaning at all, but just helps to plug a gap in speech. We also use fillers to hedge, and hedging is an important feature of spoken discourse. Hedging makes what we say less direct or less forceful. When we say sort of, kinda, like, we make what we say intentionally more vague. This is also a politeness feature because, as I said, in spoken communication, we tend to avoid being too direct as a way of respecting the politeness needs of people that we're communicating with. These fillers can also be repetitions or forms of false starts. Sometimes when we're thinking about how to position a sentence, we might false start it multiple times, and that might give us some kind of unconscious repetitions. And then finally, there's an example of cliched phrases used as fillers. There's some fantastic examples of interviews with footballers where the spoken discourse is about 50% cliche at the end of the day. I think, is it Stephen Gerrard is famous for repeating, I can't remember what his phrase is, but I think he repeats you know, and he uses that about 2 or 3 times per sentence. Actually, unless you are aware of that, you actually, it doesn't obstruct the ability to communicate at all, and unless someone points it out to you, you might not notice that in an individual's speech at all. Why? Simply because you're attuned to interpreting the meaning, and people have their own idiosyncratic way of speaking that we accept, and it doesn't actually detract from their ability to convey meaning to us. We also pause, and we can pause in a couple of ways. We can pause in a voiced way, these hesitational sounds that sometimes can be really quite strange. And of course they act as a form of pause or filler, but we can also have unvoiced silent pauses, marked in text as micropauses with a full stop in the brackets, or as a timed pause in seconds, and 3-second pause in a spoken discourse would be an example of quite a long pause. I can only imagine that would come after a very awkward question being asked, perhaps in the context of like a job interview where a very difficult or challenging question is asked, and an individual who's being very cautious and direct about what they're saying and attempting not to use fillers or hedges or cliches would perhaps take a very long pause to think about responding. There aren't many pauses in spoken language. Normally, conversation and speech is continuous and fluent. Okay, another chance to pause and look at this extract picked out of Paris. This is from one of the personal accounts of Paris. And here's an individual who is trying to keep the topic going. And can you identify features of non-fluency that are used in this short extract? So there's some good examples here of perhaps someone who's not 100% confident on the topic, and that hedging, for example, it's kind of tunnely escalator things. Actually, this speaker creates a new little construction, tunnely escalator things, a light-hearted description of what she's describing, but that's her way, I think, of communicating her lack of authority on the topic, and she's communicating to her listeners perhaps this isn't something that she knows very well. She's also being polite and indirect. She uses voiced pauses, which suggest that she's perhaps choosing the next direction for her speech. She also uses laughter in a slightly awkward or embarrassed way as a kind of filler. So perhaps we could use that. We could explain that as a kind of voiced pause, laughter. We also have these unvoiced pauses, which you notice the pauses become more frequent as she nears the end of her topic, perhaps suggesting that she's actually run out of things to say. And then we get these fillers as well, which suggest that she doesn't quite know how to end the topic. And finally, she chooses to end it with this non-grammatical construction, art good, which is sort of a playful way of ending. So we can interpret in the context of a speaker trying to speak continuously and fluently on a subject they don't perhaps have tons to say about. You then see a lot of non-fluency features in the extract. So hopefully I'm being a little bit more direct and clear about my topic that I'm speaking to you here today, because it's something that I know well and I've prepared well. But obviously in different contexts, yes, we then start to see non-fluency features proliferate in a piece of speech. Okay, we're now on to structure, and it's worth thinking about topic control and how topics are set and controlled in spoken discourse. That's a picture of a topic chocolate bar. Other chocolate bars are available. I've never actually had a topic. I see them in shops. Who buys topics? I don't know, but they're there. But topic means simply the subject of a discussion. And within spoken discourse, topics have to be controlled and maintained coherently so that we know what we're talking about, whether we're listening or whether we're taking part. And there are all manner of linguistic cues used for managing topics, and we normally call these discourse markers or topic markers. These help to establish and identify a subject of discourse, but then we have other features of how that topic is then managed. For example, there are topic closing signals which show where a speaker is concluding a topic, and we might have interpreted the non-fluency features in the previous extract as an example of topic closing signals. We've also got topic shifts, where a topic is introduced or connected or changed. Sometimes that's a kind of a refinement, or sometimes it's a broad shift from one topic to a completely different topic. Sometimes it might be, as I said, a refinement in terms of another topic within an already existing topic. We then have in conversation topic loops, which is where a speaker brings back the discourse to a previously mentioned topic or reconnects back. And these are actually quite common and in conversational dialogue. It's like what you said earlier, a common little phrase that we hear in speech. Before when you were saying, and we bring back the topic and reconnect. There's also the question of topic sequencing and how ideas are put into a given order. And sometimes that can be explicit in planned discourse. So by explicit we mean obvious, we mean clear, we mean apparent. For example, if you plan a speech and you use the discourse markers firstly, secondly, thirdly, finally, then clearly the planned nature of your discourse means that your topic sequencing is very explicit and very direct. Whereas if you're in a conversation with friends, your topic sequencing is much less structured, much more spontaneous, and it might appear chaotic or random, but features like loops and shifts can actually help all speakers clearly follow the flow of discourse, even if it's perhaps unpredictable or unplanned. We can say that in conversation, topic control is what we would call a sign of conversational dominance, but if you look in the box, again, we might consider contextual variables that would change the level of topic control. So, for example, if I was to go and interview my hero, someone that I look up to, someone with great status, we might find that as in the role of interviewer, I was doing a lot of the topic management or topic control, despite actually having a lower status than the person that I was speaking to. So it's not necessarily true to say that conversational dominance means control of topic. As we've already considered, casual chatter among friends, here topic control tends to be very much shared, and everyone has perhaps the right to change and control topic. Transactional conversations, i.e. meetings or say purchases. We talked about transactional functions in lesson 1, where we're looking at speech that has a job to do, where there's a kind of shared purpose or goal between two people. They're trying to get something done. Topic sequencing in those tends to be very goal driven and so possibly more direct. Debates are an example of a spoken context in which there's a lot of spontaneous speech, but there's also perhaps some quite strictly controlled topic management put in place by the actual nature of the debate. For example, in a debate where you propose a motion and then you make time for different people to speak on the motion, sort of a formalised kind of topic management. Okay, continuing on a structural approach, within topics, how do we hold together what we say about a topic? Well, in order to do that, we use what we would call cohesive devices. And cohesion means holding together. Cohesive devices are those devices that enable us to connect the parts of our speech or writing so that we can show listeners how they're connected. These also function equally well in written language. These aren't a unique aspect of spoken language. So exophoric references are references where the meaning of whatever's being referenced is outside the text, i.e. it is not established in this particular discourse, either in the piece of written discourse or within the speech. So for example, when two people get together to talk about something euphemistically, you know that guy, oh yeah, him, yeah, well, you know what he did. And actually we find that the meaning of who he is or that guy actually never enters the discourse itself. We could call that a kind of exophoric reference. Usually, of course, within speech or writing, we look to give that kind of context to our listeners. And writers, of course, usually explain the things that they're talking about. So more common is to have what we would call endophoric references, which are references within a text. And these divide into two categories. Anaphoric reference, which is an example of a reference referring backwards to something that's already been established, and a cataphoric reference, which is referring forward to something that hasn't yet been established. Now, cohesive devices you will already be familiar with because they are pronouns, or they are most often pronouns. So, for example, it's normal when I'm talking about someone to use their, let's say I'm talking about my friend Tim. Well, the thing about Tim is that he does this, and he does this, and he does this and that. Once I've used his proper name, Tim, I can then use anaphoric reference by using he to refer back to him as he's already established. But there are examples where we perhaps use the pronoun before the proper noun that it refers to, or any kind of noun that pronoun has replaced, and that would be an example of cataphoric reference. Press pause right now. Have a look at that very short italicized extract there. It's only 3 sentences. Can you identify the kinds of cohesive device that have been used in that very short text? Okay, hopefully you picked up that the opening sentence started with a kind of cataphoric reference. The thing is, what was that thing? The thing was acting as a pronoun for this particular act, was replacing this particular act, and that was I didn't pay Stan. So that was an example of cataphoric reference, and we then got a couple of examples of anaphoric reference. Stan's name gets established and he's later referred to as he, and then he got angry and that led to a fight. So an example of how we could use terms like that, the thing is, he, to refer to aspects that have already been established elsewhere in a text. The next thing I knew, it had happened, and again we discussed how exophoric references can point outside the text but in a way that's not established. Now, in this context, that could be a shared understanding between speakers in a spoken context, or it could be sometimes a deliberate ambiguity from the speaker. And we see that poets use these cohesive devices quite frequently as a way of guiding their reader's understanding or introducing a form of kind of controlled ambiguity to keep a reader guessing. Okay, the final focus then for this lesson is going to be looking at turn taking, and so let's consider this question. You are talking with one or two or more of your friends, and in conversation, how do you signal the following things? How do you signal that you want to continue speaking? How do you signal that you are done speaking or that you want to hand over speech to someone else? If you're not speaking, how do you signal that you want to begin speaking? Or how do you signal that you want to continue speaking? How do you signal that you want the person speaking to continue, i.e. that you don't want to start speaking? The visual metaphor there of the traffic light is a good one. Actually, we have signals, much like traffic lights in conversational language, which control the flow of conversation and prevent, if you like, all the participants from coming at it from their own angles, in which case we get some kind of chaotic crash situation. If you've ever been in a conversation where people are talking over each other, you'll know that it's bewildering and that actually communication can't really take place. So we tend, unless we're perhaps very hyperactive, we tend not to blurt out in these situations, and we tend to wait for what we call signals or cues for conversational turn taking. Pause the video now, consider how you would do verbal and non-verbal things that would help you to give those signals to other speakers. Okay, conversation obviously has its own cohesive features that help us to take turns, and you may have considered that when you want to keep speaking, you use non-fluency features to maintain the flow of our speech, as we looked at before. So, for example, you use fillers, or you use hedging or cliche, or you use voiced pauses to keep your flow of speech going in a way that shows that you're continuing. You also can defend yourself from interruptions by raising tone, usually, or by sometimes raising the tempo of what we say. And actually, when people try and interrupt us, we tend to speed up what we say in order to try and dominate or try and retain control of the conversation. That's not always a rude thing to do, by the way. In spontaneous conversation, you and your friends, you will be frequently overlapping each other, and this is very common. So what we would call a prosodic cue would be a cue related to the sound or intonation of speech. So rather than about what you're saying, it's about the way that you're saying it. So we have non-fluency features and prosodic cues used to retain a speaking voice. If you want to give up speech, as the girl did perhaps in that last extract that we looked at, then there are ways of doing that. And one very common way is to use tag questions at the end of a speech to invite a response. Don't you agree? Now, that's a very explicit example of a cue that brings in another speaker. We can, of course, actually use tag questions sometimes in a way when we don't expect a response. For example, a lecturer teaching a lecture can use tag questions as a almost conversational way of checking his listeners' understandings, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's inviting an interruption. We use concluding phrases or explicit handovers as a way of, this is similar to topic management, of kind of showing that we've finished with a particular topic. And what do you think? An example of a tag question, a kind of an explicit handover. We also use prosodic features to relinquish speech. We slow our tempo, we let our intonation drop, and we elongate our syllables. Anyone else want to talk about this? Yeah. So we slow our speech down and we elongate things as a way of showing that we're welcoming other people to come in, and we use increased hesitancy such as fillers and pauses and so on. We very rarely just stop speaking. I suppose we could also do that, and I'm sure it happens because speech is incredibly varied, but it's not the common way of doing things. When we want to start speaking in a conversation where we're not speaking, we can intervene by overlapping or by interrupting. So a lot of conversational speech overlaps or features these interruptions, and sometimes the overlapping feature is actually not necessarily a form of intervention, but sometimes it is if another speaker then starts to speak deliberately and purposefully, then they're showing that they actually want to take over the topic. So overlapping needs to be interpreted correctly in the context of the transcript that you have in front of you, but it can be a signal that someone wants to start speaking. We also use paralinguistic, extralinguistic, i.e. non-verbal cues, gesture or eye contact, a hand gesture, or looking at a speaker, or a gesture that shows that we're starting or wanting to speak. And our listener will normally interpret that, and sometimes they'll wind their speech up, or sometimes they'll defend themselves from interruption. Sometimes we're just happy listening, but we still involve ourselves, or we still do things to show that we are actively engaged in listening, and listening is an active process. So we offer our speakers a kind of reassurance through what we would call verbal feedback. Yeah, I know. Or we repeat aspects of what they're saying. So if they might be talking about the football, we say, the football, yeah. So we repeat an aspect of what they're saying, which is our way of communicating, conveying that we are following along the thread of what we're doing. Of course, sometimes any married man will tell you that you can train yourself to offer verbal feedback without actually listening to a word that's being said to you, and so that later, when you're accused, when you're asked about, did you know we were going out for dinner tonight? You say, no, I was never told, and your partner swears down that they absolutely told you. In fact, what they did was they told you, and you sat there going, yeah, oh yeah, right, overlapping, offering verbal feedback, but not actually listening to a word that you were told. I think students are equally capable of doing this, of looking like they're listening when they actually aren't. So, yes. Back channeling is verbal feedback. Is an example of back channeling. These overlapping noises that we make that show that we are connected or engaged, and we can also use paralinguistic feedback. So we nod our head and we raise our eyebrows to show that we're engaged. One interesting context in which we use a lot more verbal feedback is when we are talking on the phone, because our paralinguistic feedback is unavailable to us. And actually, if you're talking on the phone to someone and you don't get any verbal feedback or back channeling for even a fairly short amount of time, you will actually start to very quickly think, are they still there? Because phone connections are, I guess, can be erratic. And we often say, you still there? Are you listening? So they play a very important function in phone conversations where we can't actually visually check that our listeners are listening to us. Okay, so here's to finalise. Here's two different extracts. Now they have all of the features that we've looked at before in terms of topic control, in terms of non-fluency, lexical features, grammatical features, but perhaps particularly we should pause at this point and think about the nature of turn taking in these two extracts. Okay, you'll notice that in the first extract, the one on the left there, we have a conversation between Sophia, Isabel and Mike, and it's Isabel who is doing the talking. Mike and Sophia are basically taking it in turns to offer Isabel verbal feedback in the form of back channeling to, I guess, show that they want Isabel to continue speaking. There's also some overlapping there where Isabel makes a little joke about her own habits, saying that she was just in it for the chips, and Mike then offers a small overlap, just the chips, to kind of reaffirm the joke, and they all then share laughter. So this is a very cooperative example of speech, where Mike and Sophia are obviously listening to Isabel, and not only that, but they're using other verbal ways of confirming that they're listening, such as their laughter. And that joke is so good, they all laugh at it twice. In the other extract, we see Sophia and Mike, a two-part conversation in which they actually are turn-taking each other by means of asking each other questions. But we also see an example towards the end of that second extract where Mike seems to be running out of, or he doesn't actually have the idea. He says, "Weren't you saying the other day," an example of a kind of a topic loop really, referring to a previous conversation, "weren't you saying the other day the Mona Lisa's like barred off with like a," and I think that his two repeated hedges there, like, are being used as fillers because he doesn't actually have the answer to this, and that then introduces Sophia to come in, and although she uses a repetition at the start of her sentence, she's able to complete the utterance. So we see Mike and Sophia kind of working together to complete each other's meaning. Particularly in this extract, they use questions to cue each other in. So we see here much more of an exchanging conversation between Mike and Sophia. Okay, so let's have a summary of what you've learned in this lesson, and you should definitely go back and pause to make sure that your notes are fully complete and that you understand the terms used here. You should have learned by now some of the distinctive linguistic features of spoken language, especially how they are used in terms of the Lexis and semantics of spoken discourse, the non-standard grammatical construction of spoken discourse, the way that non-fluency features are used to help speakers maintain continuous flowing speech, the way that spoken discourse is structured, including the way that topics are managed and controlled, and also some cohesive devices that are used within spoken discourse. And we've looked as well at turn-taking cues and how they can be analysed in extracts. So these features will all connect with your understanding of mode and pragmatics to help you interpret the extracts that you look at in your AQA Paris anthology, and hopefully when all of these things fall into place, you'll be able to give a really coherent account of any spoken text that you might see in an exam. Finally there, I have offered a glossary. Obviously, as this was looking at AO1, as this lesson was particularly focused on the terminology, there is quite a lot there. However, generally speaking, the terminology of spoken discourse is fairly straightforward. It shouldn't take too much definition to get the hang of what an interruption means, for example. I advise that you maintain a glossary, or that you certainly maintain some kind of word bank or account of the key terms to use, because they will be useful for you in future lessons when finally we get to actually look at some of the texts in Paris and apply all of this learning that we've done to those texts. So thank you once again for your focus. I hope this has been a useful lesson for you, and all the best with your study. Bye.